is a collaborative research group organized through Aegis, the consortium of African studies programs in the European Union. And our group is co-coordinated with Steve Marr at the University of Malmo, Kenny Coopers, who's at the University of Basel, and Patience Masusa, who is at the Nordic Africa Institute, as well as myself at Wayne State University in Detroit, so not in Europe. We have made it a big priority of the CRG to partner as much as possible with other organizations so that we can elevate these conversations, to think comparatively, and in particular to highlight the work of emerging scholars and people working in the Global South. And so we're really excited about this particular conversation, and appreciate the collaboration with Guhp. If we do have a Facebook page, and just put the link to that in there. You can go on there and like the Facebook page where we post announcements about events and share information. And if you wish to join the group and be part of the conversation, Steve just put the link to the website up there, so you can join and become part of that email listserv as well. So thank you again to everyone, to all the presenters, to AbdouMaliq and to everyone else for joining us over these vastly different time zones. But it's one of the things that's so magical about this about the internet right now, right? Of the many things that it causes us challenges for, these kinds of gatherings are one of the positive things. So we look forward to the conversation.
Great, so we're going to dive right in. I have the participants listed in an order that we put them on the program, so I'm just going to announce them that way, and I guess they'll have a chance to speak for 5 minutes each. Professor Simone will then offer some comments and thoughts, and we'll open it up from there. So we're delighted to have as speakers today Dr. Wangui Kimari of the University of Cape Town, based also in most of the time in Nairobi right now. Prince Guma from the British Institute in East Africa, also in Nairobi. Anwesha Ghosh, who's joining us from the National Law School of India at the University of Bengaluru. And Rafael Soares Gonçalves from the Pontifícia Universidade Católica de Rio de Janeiro, the PUC-Rio. So I'm not going to get into too much detail of their work there. You'll hear a little bit about it as they present. But I'm going to leave it over to you, Wangui, to take up from here.
Thank you so much. I'll need to share my screen at some point, so I hope that will work. Yeah. But thank you. I'll share that soon. First, I just want to say thank you. I feel really like I need way more years as a researcher and way more gray hairs to be here trying to answer some of these questions. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. I'm also grateful for many of you who've done the work that allows people like me and Prince to try and learn and follow the journeys that we've been on, and that allow us to think about urban spaces. So thank you so much. So for me, I'm still admittedly thinking about what urban theory from the South means, but as an accidental urban scholar, I will turn to the communities on the margins who have inadvertently made me an urban scholar, as I've sought to try and understand the dynamics in the dynamics in Nairobi that allow for such differentiated existences. And so in doing that, I'll be turning to a few words from two interlocutors, but also a Gikuyu saying, or a Gikuyu proverb that for me, in thinking about these words and this proverb together, hopefully allows for the pursuit of an urban theory from the South that's more just and that's more inclusive. And so I'll just share my screen just now. For some reason, sorry, I'll just do that again.
You should be able to share now.
I should, for some reason, it's not letting. I'll just try again. Apologies. Okay, great. So I first went to, and I'll start from the beginning. The reason why I call myself an accidental urban scholar is that I really wasn't thinking about urban dynamics for a long time. I think until I finished my undergrad, until I also just by fate ended up in this neighborhood called Madare in 2007, really as a young, boring middle-class undergraduate. And it's here that I began to see how some lines are very hard and fast in Nairobi. A road can determine who lives and who doesn't, who has access to water, who doesn't, whose child dies of cholera and who doesn't. And so it's very cliche, but in being immersed in this community, I then began to think, what is an urban space and how are existences in urban areas differentiated? And in thinking about I'm going to share two words from two interlocutors for me who try and maybe make concise what I'm trying to say today. So in Madare, I have a friend and also an interlocutor called Moshangi. And one day, very beautifully, as a PhD student, I went to ask him his thoughts on the 2014 Nairobi master plan. And to this question, he replied, we don't want any more masters. And so for me, and I'll talk about this a bit more, I think in theory from the urban South needs to pursue a scholarship that tries to negate all of these masters in people's lives, but I'll just pin that there for now. I have another interlocutor who, because really I'm becoming a geriatric now. I've known him since he was a young boy in maybe 14 years old in high school. And equally, I went to ask him a boring research question about the Anthropocene and what it meant for him. And to this, he replied, I would like to explain that I hope you can see that. Apart from being an activist, an artist, and a scholar, we are all taxonomists. This means that we are people trying to identify what our struggles are. An example, how do I identify class struggles? The issue of extrajudicial killings, matters such as ecological justice. We identified them as coming from the structural violence that faces us here. And this is a really important comment. What I'd like to highlight here is how he identifies that we are all taxonomists. We all have the power to name. And for me, this is really important because it really emphasizes that this young person who ordinarily in Kenya is completely misrecognized as a young man with dreadlocks who barely has any education, but he says that he's a taxonomist. He's also able to name these problems in the city. And then I'd also like to share one more proverb just to tie all of these thoughts together. Also that I find useful as I think about questions like the Anthropocene. But there's a Gikuyu proverb that says, I don't know if you can see that. Oh, I didn't even give you the English translation, but it says, Vena iguru itimenyaga. So that means that neither the sky or the earth completely know each other. So we should always be ready for the unknown, and we cannot know anything. And in thinking about the Anthropocene, I bring it up here because of the reference to the earth and the sky, and how we don't know, we should always be prepared for the reality that we don't know much, but at the same time, this should not negate our ability to action. And so I bring these three kind of quite disparate words here in my 5 minutes, just because I think for me, urban theory from the South needs to negate all the masters, needs to negate masters. We can't, whether the master is the orthodoxies of academia, whether the masters are these institutions that we've given power to, we need to think about these masters and refuse them. And then, so we don't want any more masters learning from Oshangi. We can also learn from Stoneface, who says that we all have the power to name, and we must allow for everyone to have this power to name. And that also includes naming who these different masters are, but also thinking about our condition as something that should be named, and not doing away with all of these, I find in Kenya, there've been lots of developmentalist approaches to thinking about the city, but there's so many other ways to think about them. And for Stoneface, he names himself, he's an activist, he's an artist and a scholar, but he identifies what he's going through. The ecological injustices as also tied to extrajudicial killings and structural violence. And equally, we can learn from these sayings. How can we use our local sayings, our not to romanticize culture, but our cultural sayings to try and think about what is seen as epochal, as new, as the Anthropocene. But they've been always these sayings established in our context that can help us think about that. And one way, I know my 5 minutes is almost up. I think one picture that kind of condenses this for me, this is a picture you'd think it's just people planting a tree, but what's happening here is people who've been bereaved through police killings, planting a tree to memorialize those who've been killed. And intentionally, that tree is not just an aesthetic tree, but it's a fruit tree so that people can eat from it. And so for me, this picture symbolizes refusing the masters that are killing children, that are saying you shouldn't recognize them because they're thieves. At the same time, it gives them the power to name the issue. They name the issue, and for them also enacting this ecological justice is not just ecological justice, just as new Nairobi gardeners, but ecological justice to name issues, to refuse masters. And it also builds on what the different philosophies about trees, on the different situated understandings of trees and community, and the need to sustain this tree as a way of discipline, as a way of memory, as a way of food. So this picture, just by way of concluding, hopefully also helps push what I think should be urban theory from the South, one that refuses masters, whether it's in the orthodoxies of the academy or in the power that shapes the landscapes, one that gives everyone the power to name, but that one that builds on their knowledges and their actions. So thank you. I'll stop for now.
Thank you, Wangui. Thank you so much. What a great way to get us going here. I'm going to pass it on to Prince Guma. And Prince, do you need to be made host? I'll be happy to do that for you if you have slides. Do you want to share a screen?
He's mute.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. Oh, I see why. Okay. Okay, Prince, if you can hear me, you are now host. You can do any sharing you'd like.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Actually, I think there was a slight problem on my side. I couldn't hear the connection very well. So just let me know, please, if you can't hear me. If you can't hear me well, hopefully my connection will be okay. But I'm really very happy to be here and to share my reflections. So I won't be showing any slides, but perhaps I would like to build up onto what Wangui just said, just in being really thankful to be here and sharing this space with everybody else. So with my 5 minutes, what I really want to share is some bits of reflections that perhaps were quite instrumental in my PhD process, perhaps in how I really understand urban studies, but also how I understand my place within it. So starting my PhD, I was co-opted into a program with 8 PhD students, and that's in Germany, in Darmstadt. And among those students, we were 6 African students, actually 4 African students, 2, 1 from India, and 3 or 4 from Europe. And so in this program, as would be the case with any other PhD program, there's always different books and from the archives that students should familiarize themselves with. And so a lot of this literature obviously is really brilliant, but perhaps for me, one of the things that stood out is the fact that every time I came back in Nairobi and having to do my field work, we just described in Nairobi. One thing that really stood out for me is how a lot of the literature, even in a lot of places in Nairobi. And so I think for me, one of the realization perhaps was, and that's where I really want to start off with this presentation, it really was the importance of having to recognize the inherent incompleteness of the intellectual loops and circuits, not least from the global south. And part of this incompleteness is not entirely of our making, but it relates to the ontological incompleteness of our understanding of reality itself, but also the fact that theories which are produced and knowledge that is generated everywhere are constantly in the making, and sometimes often subject to continuous redefinition. And for me, that is fine. But I think where the challenge then lies is the fact that the fallback for some scholars often tends to be, the tendency to portray the global south through a kind of offhand and reductive connotations that are not only tailored to suit illusory one-size-fits-all frameworks and premises, but also perpetually underplay the existence and embeddedness of multiple overlaps and complexities. So for instance, the global south sometimes tends to be portrayed as a pathology of incompleteness, where incompleteness here, refers more to the aspect of luck, in terms of, different sites in the global south being deficient, defective, fragmented, ordinary, less developed, and so on. But it is also often rendered as unfinished, precarious, and largely informal, where the narratives here tend to be more of, a region that is mostly dysfunctional, divergent, and inadequate on its own. And then whose modernist impetus boils to the logics of incompleteness. So articulations that tend to deviate from the conventional and codified norms and notions of the preferred ideal of modernity, especially those that tend to be ordinary, mundane, and ephemeral, are often disparaged and equated as being fairly and so on. So for me, my proposition here is general incompleteness of the intellectual, a kind of completeness of the developments that tend to happen within the global south. And I think for this to be realized, it's quite important to be more open to different realities, to other forms of articulations, wherever these might be, but also different kinds of, different modes of practice, and also modes of being in the world. And in doing this, it's important to bring the locals into the critical, into a critical, innovative, and situated engagement, and also as a way of rising above the so-called regimes of silencing. Moreover, we need to be more open to reversal approaches from the margins to seek out new vocabularies from the global South. Of course, drawing on things like proverbs that Wangui just highlighted, but also we need to be keen on the different articulations that exceed the language of the normative. And as a final note, I think this is particularly important because many articulations within the global South tend to be driven by different logics, sensibilities, calculations, and rationalities. And some of these require us to be more propositional in our research, but also to be more open to different forms of articulation, and as well to be really attentive to the molecular details of urban life. So for now, I'll end it at that.
Thanks so much, brilliant, Prince Guma. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the mic on to Anwesha Ghosh, who's in Bengaluru. Anwesha, do you need, what do you need from me right now? Nothing?
I'm good. I'm
okay.
Good. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Guhp. I'm really excited to be here and in this amazing platform where we are exchanging these big ideas. So I'm coming at it from my positionality as a historian, right? So I'm trained as a historian, and my doctoral research has been looking at the ways in which municipal governance shaped and made colonial Calcutta in the 19th and some parts of the 20th century. So I'm sort of approaching the prompts that were given to us from that perspective, right? And the way I see it, the way I read it, how do urban historians do urban history from the global South is the question that I'm thinking about, right? And when I'm thinking about that, I'm also sort of thinking about the question of scale that global South brings upon us, right? I really appreciate what Wangui said about how we have to defy and we have to refuse our masters, right? And in many ways, the kind of work that my work has built on and the kind of work that I am extending upon is very much talking about how to sort of position ourselves and our studies within the larger complex reality of colonialism and colonial histories, right? So when we are talking about the global South, I'm also sort of trying to wonder what extra can we bring to the table and to our lens of analysis when we in fact bring in the global South, right? Without slipping into the same tyrannical framework of reducing, as Prince was saying, into this reductive logic of identifying set places like Bombay and Jakarta and Sao Paulo and what have you, as again, the new Paris and the Londons of the global South. How do we do that? How do we sort of extend beyond colonial histories, this relational theory of how to read global South as speaking to the global North, right? That's my first response. The second response is in terms of me articulating myself as an urban historian. I'm also somewhere distinguishing myself from the canon of historians who write about cities. So I'm making the distinction between urban histories and histories of cities. What I mean by that is with histories of cities, we take city as a stable, settled category, right? And the colonial archive will perhaps take you along the way where the city appears as this very settled and this very stable category. How do we move away from that and try to understand what is urbane in this archive is something that we are also trying to do here, right? And I'll take a very easy example of in my sort of preoccupation with the municipal archive, for example, the number of times routinely all these municipal lines will be drawn and redrawn are not just about the changing cartographical imagination of the colonial mind. This is really also about us switching between the different understandings of the urban. What I'm trying to say here is that I don't treat cities and urban as coterminous spaces, right? And so in saying that, what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to also capture the ways in which the urban extends and perhaps have different kinds of ideations beyond what we set as the set contours of the city spaces, right? And my third sort of response is not so much in terms of how urban historians are routinely borrowing from social sciences, but I'm trying to sort of position urban history within the broader disciplinary framework of, say, urban studies, right? And I have increasingly noticed how urban studies sort of has ostracized urban history in many ways, where urban history also has to it just is a placeholder and is a footnote merely in a very perfunctory manner in urban studies discussions, right? One of the things that Carl had sent me on the first email was, so what if Gautam Bhan was to tell us that we need to write from the basti, from the urban slums of India, and not on the slums of India? I think what really complicates and enriches our understanding more is if we bring in a very historical sort of sensitivity to this question to further extend it and perhaps ask, using Sheetal Chabria here, who's written about the making of the modern slum, that the slum itself has been for the longest time part of the colonial planning imagination, until it in fact got dismissed as a biopolitical problem, right? So if we start there, perhaps the question of we should write from the slum or write from the basti and not on the basti becomes further complicated. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anwesha. Really, really interesting remarks. And I'm sure that Rafael will have something to say about these subjects too. So I'm going to pass it on to you. Do you need anything from me, Rafael?
Yeah. I want to share my screen.
Okay. I'm going to make you a host, at least for a little bit, and you go ahead and share.
Okay. If I put in the big screen, 1 minute. It changed?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm grateful for Carl Nightingale's invitation to share some of my experience as an urban historian from the Global South. My work has been focused specifically on the favelas and informal areas of Rio de Janeiro and the other Latin American cities. It's an honor for me to share this table with my colleagues. Before introducing the central issues of the discussion, I would like to apologize for my English. You can see I don't speak it very well, but I promise to do my best. So it's the reason that I try to read, because I am afraid to lose my words. And I have just some few minutes. I want to get in the debate about the concept of the urban global south. For instance, the interest point here is therefore to search for new urban paradigms and perspectives in which the reference are not necessarily to or solely the urban history of the so-called Western countries. For example, when we analyze the urban reforms at the beginning of the 19th century in Rio de Janeiro, we talk about the Osmanization of the city, and we forget to analyze the space of sociability built after the abolition of slavery in 1888. Most of them configuring the current favelas. So more than half of Brazil is composed of Afro-Brazilians. In Brazil, we have not sufficiently talked about our cities in their racial aspects yet. However, historical sources have always indicated an extremely racist representation of the favelas. This exchange of viewpoints on urban theories produce interesting confluences that are not merely some kind of appropriation of foreign ideas. Rio de Janeiro and Brazil, for example, were deeply influenced by modernist architecture and influenced the modernist architecture. which coexist with the favelas despite the main criticism against these urban spaces. A decolonized urban theorist point of view is necessary and results in stimulating perspectives of some places. Although the favelas have always been classified by their lack of attributes needed in order to be considered formal parts of the city, they have existed at least since the mid-19th century. So they are a very large and fascinating history. Favelas are obviously not a reality distinct to the urban global south. Many of the global north's peripheries emerged at the end of the 19th century by self-construction and on land with some form of legal precariousness. The difference is that even though we in the global south have condemned such a space in the history, they have consolidated in our cities as informal and different areas during the time. The state itself has played a role in historically maintaining precarious and temporary aspects of favelas. Moreover, there are not spontaneous spaces, but are deeply integrated in urban everyday life. The long-time accumulation of experience has established local forms of knowledge that are expressed in political forms of organization, in technical solutions, for example, for the implementation of electricity and water supply, several different cultural practices, and even influence varied fields of knowledge, such as the law. These spaces present possibilities that emerge with the precariousness of these areas. The favela should not be viewed as urban problems, but as places, like many others in the cities of the South, with problems. To conclude, I would like to emphasize two important aspects that reveal the connection and the particularities of urban history within urban theory debates. Even in Rio de Janeiro, for instance, historians were the last social science scholars to more systematically study local favelas, undertaking that social works, geographers, urban planners, anthropologists, and even legal scholars have been discussing since the 1940s. I believe that two issues are crucial for understanding the delay of historian. The first is epistemological. Favelas were not considered to be formal parts of the city, and the history of these neighborhoods was therefore not recognized. Second, and related to the first point, there are clear methodological challenges resulting from the absence of official archives and sources. We know the political aspects of archives and the difficulty of many Southern countries to invest in archives, and how this is even more of an issue when it comes to their informal areas. However, other disciplines understand the importance to integrate historical reflection in their studies. Only since the 2000s have historians started thinking more seriously about the favelas and informal urban spaces in general. Here, historians have a tremendous opportunity to contribute. Urban theories have often provided ready-made explanation, and a serious historical reflection can deconstruct some of the stereotypes and help improve urban analysis of today's cities. Finally, we can observe, at least in Brazil, that some of the initiative of local historians come from their own residents. Many social movements in favelas strive to build archives and organize local museums in a political effort. This has become even clearer with the recent increase in university attendance among favelas residents since the period that the political left was in power. Most of them are my students, and I'm sure they will be my colleagues very, very soon. This broadened the debate of the whole of history and reinforced its social function. I think that there is a fantastic contribution in theoretical and practical terms from this experience for both the global South and the North. In a way, the new urban utopias perhaps looks to the past. And I think that the right to the seat for the favelas and informal areas on the global South passes first of all through the right to the past. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rafael. You've heard now from a rising generation of Global South urban theorists, and we're going to pass it on to much anticipated comments from Professor Simone. Professor Simone, do you need me to add anything for you?
No, it's okay, Carl.
Okay,
Thanks.
you're on then.
So thank you, Prince and Wangui and Anwesha and Rafael for these insights, sharing your ideas. I'm not going to weigh in as much as I'm going to try to throw back to you some questions about what it is that you were talking about. Some conundrums, some complexities, and to see what you think about it, how it matters to you in your work and your own determination to think more inventively in terms of a theoretical practice for that work. So I want to sort of understand more about what it means to be located. So when Gautam talks about, you know, writing from the basti or writing from anywhere, I mean the insistence upon not writing on but writing from. What is that location? Because in some ways, to be located always reveals again the kind of insufficiency of bifurcation as a kind of conceptual move. To be identified, to be located, always entails a kind of reification of all different kinds of relationships. It is the kind of instituting a hierarchy of relational values that enables someone to say, okay, this is the location from which I am writing from. Well, I mean, there are pragmatic aspects of this. You have to write from somewhere. I mean, there is a somewhere from which you are writing. And I think what Gautam raises here is that there is a kind of urgency to make that location from which you're writing systematic in some ways, viable in some ways, exemplary of a particular kind of efficacy that otherwise is not really apprehendable from the outside. So in some ways, there is this kind of necessity to make it systematic, to make it translatable in a way, to say that that I write from a place that has some kind of value, that has some kind of logic, that has some kind of histories of experimentation, of recalibration, of endurance, of making something happen. So there is that kind of necessity, but at the same time, when he says you write from the basti, it also means that there is a specificity there that can't be translated, that there is something that really can't borrow the language of the master, to use Wangui's term. You can't use that kind of narrative. You can't use that analytic. That somehow it resists, it refuses it is conveyed within a kind of language that cannot be translated. It has that kind of specificity. So there is that conundrum then about the need to be able to convey, to make oneself understandable, worthwhile within the terms that you have established, that are always potentially translatable. But there's something that always is left, not behind, but left somewhere else, that veers off, that is not recuperable within that language. So I guess my question is, in some ways, what do you do with that? What do you do with that particular kind of conundrum? That has to do with the sense of being located and settled. Because in some ways it was always the conceit of the city to be located. I mean, the location, the locatedness of the equation between individual freedom and property, you know? So this was a kind of equation that located you. The notion of the individual subject, which was the infrastructural possibility of the city, always demanded something else, something beyond it, something out there that was also inside. And what the city always demanded historically was blackness. So blackness becomes that which in some ways remains both inside and outside of that kind of ability to locate the valued expression of the human within terms of individual freedom, which was the infrastructural possibility of the city. So when you say, you know, to extend beyond that, so extending beyond that is a Black concept. You know, this notion of extension beyond the notion of the subject, beyond the conceit of the city, beyond the sense that the city itself was the embodiment of the urban. And so this notion of extension, of course, is folded into sort of Lefebvrean terms in terms of extended urbanization, in a way in which the logics of urbanization go beyond that of the city. But can you do more with this notion of extension? Because in some ways, my question is, how does the notion of extension then relate to the notion of refusal? And in what sense does the sort of insistence on the refusal of the master still participate within a kind of logic of bifurcation, a kind of logic which ontologizes the difference between self and other, white and Black, North and South? To what extent is refusal a kind of reiteration of that logic, even if it is a pragmatic necessity? And what might, Anwesha, your notion of extension provide as a kind of something else, something that breaks out of that kind of notion of bifurcation? And then finally, the last sort of provocation I would like to offer around this notion of locatedness is a sense of, again, this sense that inhabitants of the urban always are acting and enunciating from somewhere. And I don't want to. You can't deny that kind of specificity, as I was trying to say before. But it seems to me that particularly across the South, if it continues to exist as which I think it does, just in terms of a kind of pragmatic concept. If across many of the urban spaces of the South, what you find is a kind of increasing indifference to the specificity of where people are located, particularly amongst youth. Youth who are very aware of the kinds of specific conditions and, as Wangui says, differentiated existences of which they are a part of, who are aware of the incompleteness of the narratives which characterize the way in which they are represented. I mean, they're aware of all of these things, but who increasingly attempt to stylize their existence and their performance in the world as if it is being addressed to everywhere and coming from anywhere. That is this sort of intensified sense of a relationship between everywhereness and anywhereness, and a kind of indifference to the demand of being incorporated as a citizen of a particular kind of place or a particular kind of framework, a particular kind of context, complete sort of disinterest in what the state has to offer or whatever it has to say, complete, I mean, increasing indifference to the kinds of cultural frameworks of which they are a part, and where in some ways at times the surface intensification of identitarian politics, of religious nationalisms, populist sentiments, in some ways point to their inverse. They point into their inverse as a kind of escalating indifference to these notions of belonging. So in terms of this notion of locatedness, what it means to be located, what do you perhaps make of this kind of stylizing of everyday performance, largely through various social medias, appealing and registering one's existence as if it is coming from anywhere and addressed to, in some sense, everywhere. And so what these implications then might mean to retaining the notion of the South, even as what my friend and long-term collaborator Edgar Peterson will insist is simply a methodological tool. What are the implications for even that, if not a kind of sense of a structured geography? And in terms of some of the things that you have been discussing, so these would be my kind of provocations, centered around the kind of conundrums and complexities of this notion of what it means to be located in a world that is increasingly unsettled in all different kinds of ways.
Thank you so much, Professor Simone, for these remarks and for these provocations. Can we turn it over to the panel and anyone who in the panel who would like to start?
May I? Thank you, Professor Simone, for those wonderful provocations. So just as you were talking about, I do agree that, Bhan is also talking about finding a vocabulary for Southernness, which is not borrowed from the master, and bringing about that sort of rootedness in urban theory from the South. I also quite like this idea of that which is slipping away, even as there is this conceit of the city to pull everything within its logic. And I do want to locate myself, especially when I was talking about this redrawing of the map. This is not just happening at the administrative level, but I'm also sort of translating it across experiences of lives which were, peripheral and are now part of the city. So how the ways in which the administration is also sort of informing the lives of these citizens in 19th and 20th century Calcutta. But I'm also sort of locating them within this tension. So just as you're talking about this refusal to sort of get folded in. So there is this excess, this surfeit that is coming out of it. I'm also thinking about that tension that resides between the push and the pull between the city and the urban, if that makes sense. So in trying to redraw the contours over and over again, the ones who get left out and get stuck at the interstices of the city and the urban nexus, I've tried to sort of capture that through the figuration of, say, landed property owners, et cetera, in Calcutta, to understand how they are not entirely submitting to the logic of the colonial property regime, but are constantly trying to, sort of re-articulate themselves within this changing landscape of property accumulation. And I feel that one way of responding to how do you find that these Southern actors are sort of residing these spaces between the city and the urban, one way of coming at it would be to also sort of rethink what Ashish Nandy is talking about in terms of unintended cities. My reading would be that these Southern actors are not, in fact, the products of a certain kind of accident or unintendedness, if you will, that they are simply the victims of different kinds of planning tyrannies, that they have, in fact, a certain kind of deliberateness in their action, even as they get folded into, you know, the everydayness of colonial administration, everyday administration, etc., and in the ways in which they are sort of subverting the system from within, from inside. So I don't think that these are unintended cities, these are accidental cities, these are surfaces, etc. But the way in which is sort of ironical if you think about it, because there is this question of rootedness, but that rootedness is on a very shifting plane, because that entire existence is sort of constantly being revised and reviewed and you know, put back in. So I would say that in dwelling in these spaces, they're also sort of creating these kinds of breaks, which are not entirely getting folded in, and in that sort of registering their refusal.
Thanks. Others?
Prince Rafael can go ahead, and I have some things to say, but I can wait. Because I started first, so maybe I should cede the table. Rafael?
So I can some few words. I think that how to construct a methodological way to work about the urban areas, the south and the south. So first, I think for the historian, first of all, I think you need to have a large creativity to find the archives, the source, and of course the oral history to heard a lot the people, because it's really difficult to find the documents. Second, I think that not to be very fixed, for example, in some expression and explication like populism or clientelism. So I really want to hear the people, to understand, because normally we impose some information, stereotype, for example, informal areas, informal situations sometimes are very, there are a very strong and beautiful technical support to, for example, I study a lot of water, informal water supplies, that it's incredible what the people do. Sometimes we name it this kind of system like informal, like a bad and not a good situation. So I really want to understand the process. And for that, I think that it's really important. I think a lot that there are a memory of the place. So for me, even I try to work about the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, I think that we need absolutely to feel the place, to touch the place, to walk in this street. I think that it's changed completely for us, the idea, if we don't live there, of course, because for me, it's much more easier because I don't teach at a history department, I teach at a social work department. Most of my students come from the favela, so it's much more easier because the experience is something that they had in their life. So, but I think that it's really important. And I try a lot to understand the process that the neighborhood emerges and constructs. For example, I try to touch the needs of the people, so water, electricity, for example, the recreation association, for example, Samba School here in Brazil. Samba School is not only an institution that works just for the parade during the carnival. There are a very strong and important political influence, and also to construct the Blackness identity for the population. So it's really important. And to finish, I think that the state is an actor that we need absolutely to pay attention, of course. But for the historians, sometimes if we take just only the documents produced by the states, it was a very difficult way to understand this process. So for me, it's really, really interesting. And I work a lot with social memory, actually, because it's something, it's a kind of political tool from some local association to construct, for example, museum, archives. There are some favelas that try to construct an archives about their history. So it's something for them really, really important. They want to construct their own history. So I think we can contribute a lot with them. And to finish, I think that it's really interesting, the idea of the extension. And I think in the case of Rio, the geography of Rio, it's very particular. So for us, the extension is not only in a horizontal way, but also in a vertical way. So it's really interesting to understand the geography and the particularity of Rio. And also there are the same process in the same results that we told before. So thanks.
Prince, do you want to jump in, or should we give it to Wangui?
Yes, sure, I can jump in. I mean, the provocation was quite a thought-provoking. And I think for me, in my own work, the aspects of locatedness and extensions really become apparent when it comes to how do you actually, interpret a space? How do you engage with, a particular site, excavated or not? And so for me, it's really more about, seeing these kinds of sites or contexts or different articulations, not necessarily as self-contained units of an analysis, but rather as, a kind of engagement. Obviously, they're open to the world and, different kinds of influences from elsewhere. Then it really becomes important in how we try to understand these kinds of sites as sites that aren't necessarily self-contained, but rather are points of engagement. So in so doing, there are different scholars who've pointed about, aspects of, why we need more at the ordinariness of these sites, like Vanessa Watson, aspects of heterogeneity, different assemblages, from Maliq's work, but also the different forms of organizing that often become apparent within these kinds of spaces. And so I think it really becomes really important to, go beyond ideal types in trying to understand them as, dwellings or domains in the global south that as, simply, reduced to their social, cultural, political, historical, or, to these kinds of contexts, and also try to understand them as contexts that are really open to, different kinds of influences from the neoliberal and market-oriented innovations, in globalization itself, development and post-coloniality as well. So for me, really, in my work, I think it's, the aspect that becomes really critical is how dwellings and structures are not necessarily to be seen as sites that are necessarily homogeneous, structurally or demographically, but rather as sites that are often really diverse. And so by so being, really diverse and heterogeneous, and then in that case, really, what kinds of concepts do we apply to portray these sites as sites that are really complex in a way that they are not necessarily viewed as sites that are unsophisticated or less developed and so on. So for me, this is really what it comes back to really the aspect of really understanding the sites as a point of analysis that really opens up different kinds of interpretations, drawing from these different engagements that they're often exposed to.
Thank you all. In terms of thinking about location, how are we located and where are we located? I think for me, in Nairobi, you can be in Nairobi, but people will think you're in New York. And why I say this is sometimes the global north also exists here in very problematic and really apartheid ways. And so when we talk about location, I think we should write from the Basti or write from geographies that are more people-centered, or at least write in a way that's layered to show the relationality between this place in Nairobi that looks like Dubai, but how it's related to these other geographies. So just, I think the importance of pursuing a location that is relational, or writing about it in relational to the more dominant geographies, but that is people-centered and layered. And some of the ways that I try and bring this to bear, I don't know how successfully, but just writing in a non-linear way, because people don't talk to you in a linear way. And often in Kenya, people will tell me things that, or refer to something that you think was in the colonial period. Like, for example, young people insult the police and call them Ngati. And Ngati is is reference to a home guard, so a colonial tool, but they're calling that person Ngati in the present. So there's a lot of reference to different temporalities, different times, the past coexisting with the present, and just finding ways to show these concomitant times and tenses is important. For me, I think it's also as part of, sometimes it's very hard. I've had lots of English indoctrination, so sometimes I don't know how to write outside of English, and English is the language of instruction here. But I think as part of trying to do away with masters, is also show how you're being refused. For me as a researcher, I'm refused all the time. I can say my topic, I'm going to try and learn about the master plan, and people say, no, shut up, we need to talk about water and electricity. And I think bringing these tensions and refusals to bear in our writing is part of showing all the refusals, and also trying yourself as a researcher not to act like a master. And Rafael was saying the importance equally of writing about real material conditions and what people are talking about. I also, part of these refusals, I'm so perturbed by the term quiet enroachment, because no one I know in Kenya enroaches quietly and so just showing, and I don't say this to romanticize Kenya or Kenyans or poor urban settlements, but just how people refuse. And Professor Malik was also saying that. And just by way of conclusion, because this is also, we've used the South here, and sometimes when we use the South, we offstage so much. And I find it's often Africa. So you're invited to Global South, and then Africa is kicked off the stage a little bit. But no, I'm not saying this is happening in this conversation, but even the term the South, we can interrogate it to see what is also being concealed here. And just to think about it, I mean, it's a broad term, and in many ways it offers important solidarity, but then it's good to think about, for us, myself also as a researcher, this term and what way of staging, and what that means from where we write from or where we choose to locate ourselves. So I'll stop now.
Thanks so much, all panelists. Professor Simone, if you have thoughts on these thoughts, we'd love to hear them. But at this point, people who in the audience who want to contribute or ask questions should feel free to raise their hand or to put something in the chat to everyone. And I'll try to make sure that that the stack gets to the presenters.
Yeah, just open it up, Carl. It's fine.
Carl, I think you're muted.
Sorry, go ahead, Stephen Legg.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these presentations. They're really fascinating. And I'm here to learn. So I just wanted to respond to one of the things which Wangui Kimari opened up with, which is this idea of master planning and the figure of the master. And obviously we don't want any more masters doing the planning. But I was just thinking about this concept of planning, and if it's a concept that might be worth fighting for. And I was just thinking of two ways into this. Now, both of these risks seem completely politically naive, so I'm going to take the risk and say them anyway. But the provocations come from two different bodies of work. The most naive one, but the most hopeful one, emerges from a series of commentaries by people in geography who've been trying to think about sort of governmentality from the left. Matt Hanna's written on this. And the assumption that is biopolitics always wants to deprive people and turn them into mechanisms of the state. And what Matt Hanna suggested is, if you look back, a lot of the people working for states are actually motivated by love for people. They are trying to actually help, but states don't always do that. And often the way they try to help people is through planning. That's just the mundane bureaucratic way in which a lot of people try to help, and it doesn't always work. So plans can actually be the ways in which a lot of people are out there day in, day out trying to help, but it might not work for structural reasons beyond their own care. So that's the really hopeful bit, but it's also the politically naive bit. The less naive bit is to think really about planning and the history of planning. So one interpretation of planning is that we think of enclosurism, we think of planning as that which allows the extension of capitalism into ever new spaces. But the alternate history of planning is that planning emerged by people trying to rein in capitalism, trying to get people access to school, education, healthcare, welfareism. So I suppose my worry is if we stop thinking about master planning, then we sort of cede claims on planning, because planning is often what people demand states do. They demand access to sewage and electricity and green space and security. And often those demands might end up in something which looks a lot like a master plan. Now, these two lines of argument are potentially very naive, but I just wonder if we need to, remind ourselves that lots of people involved in planning have good hopes. It might not always work out, but also that planning is something that people should be able to demand, and it's something you should demand of states and of governments. There is a lot of potential political naivety in there, but I just thought we could think about planning and who can make demands on it. Thank you again, I've learned so much.
We'll get a question from Rosemary in just a minute, but would anybody like to talk about that question of planning and its?
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond in the sense that if for many districts, for many people who have been dispossessed or marginalized or have to operate with few resources, in the end, the resource that they have is a capacity to plan. And so in some ways, the ability of particular kinds of urban spaces to endure, and oftentimes to do more than endure, entails oftentimes very, very systematic practices of planning. Who does what, where, and how, and with whom, and under what circumstances are always, and with what kinds of materials are always the sort of basic building blocks of planning. And certainly this is in some ways what largely auto-constructed or semi-auto-constructed districts have always had to do. And so oftentimes these communities, these districts also confront the limits of their own planning opportunities and also planning resources, and therefore will oftentimes demand that in some ways that their capacities be maximized in ways that could be with this series of affordances that are only located elsewhere. the problem oftentimes is that the logics of planning, the particular technicities of planning that are then afforded, oftentimes don't valorize the kind of planning that is already underway, which is being asked to be substantiated and complemented and supplemented by. And that's where it becomes a kind of problematic. But I don't think planning is in itself the political problematic. In the end, what oftentimes communities had were their very capacity to plan.
I don't know if I could add something. So first, until yesterday, I was convinced that everyone in the Kenyan government was trying to erase anyone who lived in the east of the city. And then which is east. And then I sat in the archives for about 4 hours, just looking at letters that were going back and forth. And I think my youthful fundamentalism was questioned, because I was always like, these technocrats don't care about poor people and it's all their fault. And really sitting in those files showed me that there was, of course, broadly abandonment of poor people, but there were some people who were trying. And so, like you, I think there's hope for planning. But at the same time, the plans that we get, whether it's the 1948 master plan for a colonial city or the 2014 master plan for Nairobi, the majority of the city is not visible in any way. It's really quite disturbing. But it doesn't stop, and there are many demands in Kenya for a people's plan and a people-centered plan, and those are ongoing. And also, at the same time, it's very, I think part of the challenges to these people's planning is that you're trying to plan for a city where the grids are already so colonial. So is the action then to undo these colonial grids, or how do you move forward? But just all of this to say, I think there's hope for, we can make some hope for planning, Steve. I don't think it's all lost, but these are just all the questions that we are grappling with.
May I?
Rosemary, why don't you jump in, or Anwesha, did you want to say something first?
Yeah, so thank you, Stephen, for that. While you were speaking, I was also thinking about Tanya Lee and the will to improve, and the kind of dilemma that we have to stay with the genuine will to improve upon the lives of people. But I'll just throw something else at you with what I came across, especially speaking of bastis and slum improvement and all of that. The first instruction was to sort of abolish slums altogether, and whatever exigencies led to them understanding that the entire abolition and rehabilitation in concrete households and working class housings was possibly not feasible for the colonial government, which is when they also sort of took recourse to slum repair. So it's interesting that we think of planning and we think of a very formal discourse of planning, which comes from above, and then whatever we do is sort of make do, right? And what we saw here, which started as a planning discourse and very quickly descended upon, okay, we'll just do repair for now, because there are these biopolitical emergencies which have to be tackled. Very soon also sort of pulled all of these residents of these informal settlements within the fold of the planning logic, because now it rested upon them to improve upon their own livelihoods and their existences, etc. So I'm also sort of looking at those kinds of slippages in the archive where planning discourses often get handed out to informal settlers, etc., who have to now sort of make do and plan, for a more repaired kind of existence. So I'll just put that out there.
Can I say some more?
Sure.
Yeah. For the problem of planning, so normally in Rio, the plan is to eradicate the favelas, but since the 18th, it's the opposite, to try to rehabilitation. But I think that there are some of violence also in this kind of project, but we don't want to eradicate, but perhaps to erase the idea of favelas on the city, not to recognize this kind of production of the city to urban production. So normally it's the idea that the favelas after the rehabilitation of the state will be a neighborhood, not to understand that favelas are nowadays, of course, a neighborhood. So I think that this kind of violence nowadays, it's worse in the context, for example, the Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro, the planning don't focus on the demands of the population. So sometimes the population said that I want to have another water system or sewage, but the state said, okay, so I will put a cable car in your favela. So it's also always like that. So I think that there are a very strong violence also in the different kind of planning the favelas areas. And to finish, without romanticism, I think that we have a lot of problems in the local plannings. But nowadays, the local movement works a lot with the ideas of the local identity. So they don't want to be integrate on the city, but to be integrate, showing that they are different. So the favelas are different. There are some, as a research, there are the different point of view, the different history. But I think that in this kind of movement, we need also to think about the ways, the tools, the mechanism to fight for the public resource. Because the problem nowadays that there are a lot of communities that don't want the state, because normally when the state starts to do something in the favelas, it's not a solution, but they create the other problems. But the people need, for example, sewage, electricity. So how to construct a political movement to fight for the public resource, respecting the particularity of these areas. I think that it's a great problem nowadays. Thanks.
Shall I move on to Rosemary Wakeman's question at this point? Prince, that's good. Okay, Rosemary Wakeman, Professor Rosemary Wakeman, who's president of the Global Urban History Project and co-coordinator of this conversation. Rosemary.
Thank you. That sounds very monumental. So thank you to all for all this wonderful discussion. Just a few ideas on what I think as the way history could participate in this discussion, which has been really very interesting. Just to take off on the planning for a second, I wonder if we could think critically about the appearance, the evolution of oligarchies within cities and how we imagine the state as functioning. So I think that's a place where historians can participate and perhaps really move our narrative forward in terms of how we imagine how municipalities work, how the state works within the colonial structure, and how oligarchies arrive and their role in planning, for example, in this case. So I think there's work that can be done there. In terms of other vocabularies that we use, relatedness and migration, or rootedness and migration, is another area I think where historians could participate here. And we've talked a lot about locality and rootedness and site here as evidence of urbanity. But I'm also thinking about the city as a very open place, right? I'm thinking about the fluidity of migration, the fluidity of trade, the fluidity of ideas. So that's, I think, another arena that in terms of urban theory would be very useful to think about critically and how we use that narrative. Formality and informality is another arena here. What do we mean by those constructs? I think the Global South has much to offer here in terms of rethinking that vocabulary and what informality means particularly Rafael's notion that there is extraordinary structure in what takes place in the evidence of infrastructure as it goes forward. And the last, because I know that there's other folks who would like to participate, is memory and the chronology of history. It could be very, very interesting to think about local memory and how that might change how we understand the chronology of a more formal sense of historical evolution. So those are areas where I think that the vocabularies really need to be reconstructed, transformed, move forward. That might help us a great deal in understanding these urban experiences. Lastly, I've always imagined the idea of the global South as a very heavy geopolitical understanding that's just rife with neoliberalism, with colonialism, with a wide variety of political perceptions. And I wonder how viable it is in the future, particularly in relation to climate change and the extraordinary migrational and geographic shifts that will require. So I just open that up. I have no answer to that, but the viability of the global South as a concept, I think, is before us. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, everyone, for a wonderful discussion.
Spontaneous jumping in is entirely part of the game now. From the panelists first, and then if you see that that's not happening, then other people as well.
I can say, just for the vocabulary, I agree. And it's a challenge for us to find a word to express the more or less this reality in different countries. So I have a network with informal, so I don't know how to say, areas, and normally we try to use the native expression. So it's the reason that I use favelas, for example, but also in Brazil, favelas is used in Rio, sometimes in São Paulo, perhaps in Belo Horizonte, but in the others city we use the others expression, and this kind of vocabulary is really rich with the senses, with the ideas, and of course with the history. So I think that we need to improve a lot this kind, and perhaps in a global South community, in urban global South community, try to find some words that can show much better the ideas, what we want to say.
So I'm just going to recall one of the ways in which I would necessarily read a colonial archive, not entirely dismiss it, but sort of read it unfaithfully, if that makes sense, which is to also say, question every category that is thrown at us as self-same and logical, like formal, informal, and planning. And I think that has also helped us to sort of also break open, pry open these different ideas that are then hegemonized and made into formal and informal, and sort of look at the historical complexities of what made it formal and what made it informal. And many a times we would see that there are, in fact, these transitions between what used to be informal, but now is semi-formalized and things like that. So I feel that, just reading the colonial archive and looking out for different other ways to sort of like fill in the gaps also, but also sort of reading the colonial archive a little bit unfaithfully also sort of helps to understand what the objective of why a certain thing is formalized as against something else.
Yeah, so I think what I could really add on that, I really do believe there are, I'm really convinced that there are many sites in the Global South that still remain unexcavated. And, this could even be as, some of the most recent, spaces like, film and, a lot of literature, by local authors. And some of these might not be the kind of literature or films that are really out there, on global standard. But a lot of this is a very significant pool of knowledge, and the kind of knowledge that still remains, highly excavated. I think just to build on to what has been said about transforming or unearthing a kind of vocabularies that reflect what is actually happening in the global south. Perhaps for me, what I really could add on to that is that speak to a mode of practice that speaks to a different way of being in the world. And whether we speak about all these master plans or all these circulating ideas and policies that end into the global south, often they don't tend to be really open to different kinds, different other modes of being in the world. And I think this is where perhaps an opportunity could be that this is something that we need to look at, not just in how the cities are planned or developed and so on, but also in how we as scholars research these different sites within these places. I think we need to be more open to different other kinds of ways of being in the world. And just like I said at the beginning, that really is very significant, sources out there within the global south that still remain, unexcavated. And some of these, could even be archaeological sites and so on. But I really feel there are really opportunities. And I think as scholars, as planners and so on, we look into this.
Thanks. I'm going to pass it to Jennifer, who was the person whose idea this whole panel was, and she approached us a long time ago, and here it is coming into being. So thanks to Jennifer from all of us. But you get to give, I think, what will probably be the last question, as we're getting towards the end of our Zoom horizon here.
I hate taking up the last question, but thank you all again for this really thoughtful and I think important conversation. I just wanted to highlight two things that maybe relate and connect some of the conversations we've been having, and one is to connect back to I can't remember if it was Prince or Wangui at the beginning talking about how Africa is almost always left out of these kind of bigger level conceptual conversations about what the city is, about urban theory. And so like there's been a number of collections over the last 10 years that have pitched themselves as global urban theory, whether that's coming from history or from whatever else, that has no case studies on Africa at all. Which I think is inexcusable, but also I think is problematic for exactly the reason that Prince is just mentioning. But I mean, connected to everything that's been talked about here. But I think especially because of what Prince is just mentioning, because certainly historians of Africa and scholars of Africa in general, for all sorts of reasons, have really been at the forefront of conceptual interventions and innovations in scholarship. Thinking about alternative sources, thinking about how we analyze those sources and what they mean, thinking outside of the archives, thinking conceptually and challenging conceptual categories, but that often doesn't get written or in conversation with scholarship in other parts of the world for all sorts of reasons that have their own histories. But I think having these conversations and ensuring that we're thinking about why, the history of why that's happening, the politics of why that's happening, and why it continues to happen, and then what it means to introduce those conversations again, to make those connections, right? What does that challenge us to do? How does it challenge us to rethink our fundamental categories or conceptualizations about the city? And how should we be pushing back? And so related to that, right? I was thinking about Anwesha's comments about the archives, and I'm working right now on a book that's tracing the history of informalization. So informalization is a historical process. And a lot of the concepts that we use frequently to talk about the city, like formality and informality, we take them as natural concepts rather than historically produced concepts, right? And this is rooted in something that AbdouMaliq was saying earlier as well. I think that, and so you know, I think that has consequences for us as historians and urban scholars, to think about what kinds of concepts we use, how we deploy them, and what that means, and to what degree do we reinforce or reproduce conceptual and categorical violence, but also very real physical violence when these ideas have been co-opted or incorporated into practice, right? And fields like planning. But also the difference, history also helps us think about the difference between kind of planning as the thoughtful organization of space and infrastructure and services that happens in all sorts of forms, as AbdouMaliq was mentioning earlier, right? Versus planning as a technocratic practice, which is connected to a long history of imperialism, and that formal practice of planning. People who are recognized as town planners, the creation of master plans, that all of those things grow out of a very specific colonial imperial history that's attached to imperial notions of public health and sanitation and hygiene and all sorts of other things, and early colonial governance. And I think we really have to think about that, right? So what does that mean for us as scholars, and what does that mean for us as people who work with practitioners, or maybe who are practitioners ourselves, right? Working in these spaces, what does that require of us, and what does it look like to, you know, is it possible to continue using that language? Is it, or do we need some more fundamental reconceptualizations of what these practices mean, what they look like? So I don't have easy answers to that. I don't think there's easy answers to them, but I would, you know, if any of you who are thinking about that, I would really love to hear if, you know, if there's projects that you're aware of, or things that you're doing in that sphere. I'd love to hear more about it. And thank you again for everything.
Last word to presenters and Professor Maliq, sorry, Professor Simone, if you're interested in joining.
I mean, I think the historical contributions can be really enormous in terms of perhaps amplifying the provisionality of contemporary dispositions of urban forms and social formations. One thing that Veronica Gago and I are trying to do is talk about the multiplicity of territories of operation and the ways in which different territories of operation converge, disjoin, align, run parallel to each other, but trying to identify that what we assume oftentimes to be the kind of predominant locus of social reproduction, that is the household, and where the household is located, and how the household is able to perform even its most minimal functions, is something that is distributed across many different kinds of spaces and itineraries and circuits, divisions of labor, logistical practices, geographies. And so there is a kind of reworked notion of a rearrangement of many types of urban forms across space, where the basic kind of social units that we sort of rely upon in order to generate particular theorizations are no longer operative as the real empirical objects anymore. And I think what history brings to the table is a way in which to say, well, what we always thought was to be the sort of stable normative objects and processes were not that, were indeed in some ways provisional, and that in some ways the problematic dynamism of the South, even under intensified disparities of extraction and resource flow, has been either the compulsion or the capacity to always rearrange what we think are the sort of operative norms of urban life.
I think that's a beautiful way of wrapping things up. If others don't have anything else to add, just the idea that locations, including the hemisphere that we're highlighting today, are provisional, are part of an ongoing sweep and change in spaces that have multiple dimensions. This is a foundational part of, I think, what global urban historians try to do, and really appreciate that thought coming at the culmination of this talk. Last thoughts. If anybody has something burning to add, we should definitely hear it. Oh, we're good. Okay, great. Well, just left to thank everyone who's participated in organizing this, in participating in it and commenting on it. Professor Simone, thanks so much for joining us on this. Participants, thanks so much. And just remember that this is part of an ongoing process, in academic world, that we see this as having filaments that move towards the future, and nothing more clear could be. One very clear sort of follow-up in this is happening in Nairobi in June. I urge you to take me up on my offer to send donations, either directly through to Wangui and Prince, or you can do it through Guhp as well. We'll give you a tax shelter. So much gratitude to all of you, and note that this conversation, if you missed something in it, will be recorded and up on the Guhp site later today, and you'll be able to access it for time immemorial. So thank you again for everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you all.